that's what we were saying, because obviously like, it was one of the modules that all of us were kind of hyped about.
I'm really looking forward to, yeah.
But then it's just turned into massive head.
Yes, it had.
I'm so tired.
Yeah.
I got to do 2 hours straight after this with second years. So I've got to finish. This is a bold claim I'm going to begin with. I've got to finish on time today. It's not because I've got to be in Glyndor somewhere at like 12, I think. It's not, is it? It's a different building. Shit. It's not good asking you guys where the second year class is it? You guys fucking don't help at all. So you all submitted, ECs, which is good. I was saying to Mason, when your assignment comes in on the 15th, morning of the 16th, I'm going to mark it and I'll release the feedback to you straight away.
Okay.
So you've got it at the same time as everyone else. So there's no delay of it. I'm doing that mostly because I'm going away on the 18th. So I can't get marked straight away. I don't know, maybe I'll do this next week, go over, I know there's not many people here. I was intending to spend 20 minutes going over the second assignment today. Should I hold it to next week?
If we've got time today, that would be good. But also if we
It's going to be recorded as well, and I can always, you know, for those who can't make it today, I can always go, well, maybe I could chuck you guys out next week if you're here and talk to them about it then, I suppose. Because I don't think next week's lecture is that long either, if I remember correctly. This one shouldn't take very long because it's bollocks. But I do feel this is probably something that people will touch on more in assignment 2 than they did in assignment 1. So it's an easy win for assignment 2, depending on what game we decide to cover in assignment 2. So has anyone looked at assignment 2, yeah, in terms of the brief, about what you've got to do? I say no.
No, it's understanding that we have to like pick a game and then like write an essay about like a certain theme or.
I would argue a set of themes. So is it? Oh, do you know, I can't even remember. My mind is gone. I think it's 2,500 words.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah, which is slightly longer than a normal essay. Most essays are 2,000 words, right? So there's a slightly longer scope to it. All I want you to do with that longer scope is perhaps to add another thematic area to your discussion of this particular game. The whole purpose, I think, of this is to reverse the intention of assignment 1, which was about how you play a particular thing and what's your engagement with it, to take a more detached, sort of objective approach to a game. Don't do the same one, and that's clear in the assignment, but within that you do anything you like. I figured a lot of people will talk about a game that has this element because we tend to talk about, and if you look at the literature around games, an easy win for assignment 2 is to look at something which has been talked about a lot, because then you can draw on the critical literature about that. On the assignment brief page, I think I've given about 8 or 9 references to things that I think would be useful in this context, because they're academic papers that take the form of a critical review of a particular game. And they split across really the most common games that have been talked about in this context as well. So there's a bunch on Grand Theft Auto, there's a bunch on Metal Gear Solid, Red Dead. This is what people have tended to talk about over time. That doesn't mean you have to do one of them. Even if you've not played one of those, they are easy to talk about in this detached sense because there's a lot about them. So I guess the story of assignment 2 is you can talk about something you've never played before, if you want, because I'm not asking you about your experience of playing it. I'm asking you to engage with the critical themes instead. And therefore, video game violence is the most tiresome nonsense ever spouted, but it is also something which so often comes up. You know, it's so frequent. I've set up a bunch of questions up. I haven't set up a Neopod this week because I figured there wouldn't be many people here this week, because Cheska told me she's got like 3 deadlines this week. And to be fair, and she will watch this, so I'm not going to say she's full of shit. But, but I get it that like this stage in the third year, it's crippling with assignments as well. This is really easy and easily digestible, I think. But I sent some questions. I didn't want to do Neopod because there's not many people here. Then, can I just have a show of hands? Who's played a violent video game? Okay, what the hell is a violent video game? As soon as you've all played one, how would you characterise a violent video game?
A video game that shows violence.
Shows. That's an interesting choice of word. So your you like the televisual experience of violence.
Yeah, or you're taking part in certain violence.
Interesting. So there can be two types of violence.
Yes.
You can see it and you can perform it. I think traditionally there's been a lot of the moral panics around violent video games have been around the representation of violence, and they've ignored the performative aspect, that it is actually us that's performing violent acts. But then, one of the key things we've got to ask is hitting someone or shooting someone actually violent in a video game? Because you're not doing that. It is important to note, when you shoot someone in a video game, you're not shooting someone. You know, I shoot a lot of people in video games for fun. You know, it's not anything to do with the mission or the plot. I just like to shoot people. But I don't go out into uplands and then commit a massacre. I mean, that would also be fun. But I don't do it, because it's really hard to get guns in this country. I fucking tried. So, you know, especially like if I go into the shop and you're serving over there, like, you know, there's a big queue for my coffee, I want to gun those sons of bitches down. But I hold back. It is never as easy as people suggest, this video game violence debate. There are two elements. There's the performative element and, if you like, the televisual or graphic element to violence in video games. And that then draws interesting things. If you take that visual element out and ask yourself, okay, from the ludic or ludology perspective, what we actually do. Is Pac-Man violent? Let's pick a classic game which you can all picture in your head, right? And I'm sure everyone's played at a game of Pac-Man at some point, right? Mm-hmm. When you take the big energy pill, is Pac-Man violent? Because I'm chasing down Inky, Blinky, Pinky, and Clyde, like and I want to take them down. Them ghosts piss me off. I want to take them. Is that? Just think about the sort of logic of it. You eat something which empowers you, and then your goal when you've eaten that is to kill these other characters. That sounds violent to me. In terms of what you're asked to do as a player, there is a violent edge to that. But we don't consider Pac-Man to be a violent game. It's a cute game, right? It's this little pizza thing that eats loads of stuff, right? It's the whole ideological thing about late capitalism embedded in it, that the only way you win is by getting fat. Which is kind of weird, but eating as much as you can is a whole like distribution of wealth thing that goes on in that game, which people don't think about. But is Space Invaders violent? Yeah, And then you have games which provoke violence, and we might not conceptualize it as violence sometimes, but we might think of it in terms of frustration, which needs to be displaced in some way. So. Even going back to like the earliest big scale arcade game that sort of boomed in the arcades in the 70s, Pong, you'd be surprised. Pong, a lot of bars in America took Pong out, even though it was really successful, because people would have fist fights. When, if somebody beat you at Pong, you would start swinging at them. And especially in a bar when you've had a couple, like. So it's a complex set of questions, which are often boiled down to a really simple set of questions. The classic formation about violent video games is that person A plays game and then commits violent act. So it's always a presupposition that there's a causal relationship between playing something which is violent and therefore moving forward. And that ignores that there are games out there which have elements of violence that we don't think of as being violent. So, for example, Jordan and Nick, big Sims players. I know you take the God position and just squash your Sims. You do. And that's a really violent act. You know, you cultivate these little cute characters, you give them a life, you give them hopes, aspirations and dreams, and then you bitch slap them into non-existence, right? You do this all the time. That's not just violent, that's callous. I mean, that's fucking heartless. So, was, you know, me, what am I playing at the moment? Oh, well, to be fair, I'm playing Sonic Frontiers at the moment. It's not particularly violent, but it is pretty good. Whizzing about and getting rings and but I do have to whoop some bosses every now and again, which I suppose is a violent thing. Sonic can punch now. It's so cool. He's got his little... I recommend it, it's amazing. So, I have a distinct argument today. Video games do not cause violent behaviour. That is the hill I'm going to die on. Right? There is no causal relationship between playing any kind of video game and violent behaviour. There can be associations between playing particular kinds of games and people exhibiting violent behaviour. I haven't got a problem with that. If you frame that argument in that way, that there is association between particular types and forms of play and violent behaviour, okay, fine. But you've got to tell me about the person that commits the violent acts. What the argument about video game violence does is it decontextualises violence itself, or aggressive behaviour, to use a better term, I think. Because it doesn't have, aggressive behaviour doesn't have to be enacted in a violent way, it can be in all sorts of different ways. If you tell me somebody who acts aggressively does this because they play a particular type of video game, I will ask you, okay, tell me about their family. Tell me about their upbringing. Tell me about their socialisation. Tell me about what happened to them between the ages of 18 months and 4 years when they have a massive period of imprinting, where we learn behavioural codes from others around us in how we act with others. Tell me about their genetic makeup. Tell me whether they've got any particular forms of learning disability, or if they have mental health issues. Tell me all of this stuff. Tell me if their nervous system is excitatory in a particular way, whether they're a massive extrovert. Tell me all of this stuff before you tell me about what games they play. Tell me what fucking films they watch. Tell me what television programs they've been exposed to. Tell me what they watch on TikTok. Tell me what they experience on YouTube. Tell me who they follow on Instagram. All of that is really, really important. One cause for something is never going to work. So historically, you guys familiar with the term moral panic? Kind of?
Yeah.
We used to do a lot about moral panics in this university because we had a guy who was a professor here until a couple of years ago, although I never saw him, called Chaz Critcher, who was involved in the original research around moral panics in like the 70s. He wrote some really cool stuff back in the 70s, but he's like 1,010 years old now. He was pretty useless, to be fair. But they started out moral panic research with like youth culture in the 60s. And this reaction against youth culture in the 60s is like, these kids, oh, look at the way they dress, and look at the music they listen to, and and all this shit. And the media works to create moral panics about things which it can then pin societal change on. So historically, video games have been used in a very specific way by the wider media in order to imply that, as society has issues with violent behaviour by individuals, here is a scapegoat for it. This means we don't have to examine the structure of society, we don't have to examine the education system, we don't have to examine the breakdown of community, we don't have to examine the breakdown of familial relations, we don't have to argue that, you know, as parents have to spend more time in the workplace, as, you know, everything has become more expensive, there are fewer opportunities to socialise children. We can ignore all that. Kids are playing Mario. Mario is responsible for this. And the people who make Mario are bad people because they've done this. You know, it's not Mario that gets blamed this way. You know, back in my day it was like Mortal Kombat. Mortal Kombat's going to make kids violent, isn't it? Well, it did make me violent because I used to lose a lot. I used to sling the fucking controller, like, you know, but it wasn't a violence based on the game. The game was like a cartoon. It was absurd. It was kind of cool when you ripped someone's spine out and held it like that. But it was so frustrating to actually get the buttons to work to do that you ended up punching the buttons, you know. So, did I go out and rip someone's spine out? I might have tried. It's really difficult. Because you pull the hair and just clumps of it come out. It's really hard, like. So, playing violent video games is, okay, if there's an association with, that I can accept. But that doesn't imply that the violence was created by the game itself. It is equally plausible, if not more plausible, to say, here is a person who has issues with aggressive behaviour, and they are attracted to games which have those tendencies in them as well, because this is an attractive way for them to amplify elements of their own personality. That's an argument which is equally plausible, but that's an argument not taken up by the popular media, or weirdly indeed by the whole discipline of psychology, which is a real problem, real bee in its bonnet about this, and it's still going on. Violent behaviour always has many, many causes, and the overall context of how that violence occurs has to be considered, and it often isn't, because it is much easier for us as a species to say one thing caused it. This isn't, I don't want to say it's just one group of people who do this. Everyone does it. You know, we look for singular, easy, you know, explanations for things. So Jordan comes in on Friday, right, and she's messing with my head. I'm like, why is Jordan doing that? Because it's like, I won't say, but you know, but you know what I mean. And when you leave, you think Leighton's no fucking help at all because he's a prick, right? And then, you know, so there's one explanation of why he's going. So games can form part of a context for this, and I think that's an important distinction to make. And therefore, if we're talking critically about how a game is received, how a game has been created, it is important to note that, you know, if somebody sets out to make something which has, you know, violent action at its core, which is a hell of a lot of games, to be fair. You know, like you did Uncharted, right? I mean, that's a core activity in that. I would argue it's perhaps not a core activity in The Sims, but you can do it. You know, there's no problem with, you know, you don't really get punished greatly for doing that either. You don't get really a reward mechanism for doing it, I suppose, but when you get bored, it's something to do, right? So it's a mechanic which is built into a vast number of games, this idea of, you know, I'm trying at the moment to not play violent video games. It's really hard. I mean, this is not an easy thing to actually even find stuff that you can play. I've got, like, What Became of Edith Finch, Thomas Was Alone, and they're really interesting, and kind of interesting emotionally as well, but I'm struggling. So that's why Stray was, I think, really refreshing, because you don't do violent stuff in Stray. You know, so I suppose it's a stealth mechanic that you're actually working on, but it was really refreshing in the summer to play something that I enjoyed, and I didn't kill anything, or maim anything, or did I hurt anything?
And you sort of blow up those little pink blobs, don't you, with like UV light, but is it that it doesn't
You
feel
do,
like violence,
yeah,
it feels
that's
more
true.
like repelling as opposed to an attacking?
It's defensive, I suppose.
Yeah.
And I think that's probably the context that it's played in.
Yeah.
It's not you're going out to kill them, you're trying to stop yourself from being hurt.
Then you could argue that for like Uncharted as well, or other games. You know, like you're doing it for
That's
most
true.
people, not seeking it out. You're defending.
That's interesting. Yeah, it is that is a distinction to be made. Whereas I think there's a mix in these mechanics very often, especially in AAA games, where you have to be on mission all the time, because sometimes you can be attacked by things, but very often you're being asked to attack things as well. So there's a mix-up of those things. Very important in any sort of argument, no cultural form ever exists in any kind of isolation. There are major causes, I would call these, adopted by the mass media. Now, I remember this vividly happening. This was the day I started a new job, so it was kind of emblazed in my mind anyway. I was working in the Sixth Form College up in Ticoch, installing computers for the Y2K bug. Yeah, so fucking old I am. For £2.75 an hour, which was the national minimum wage at that time. Believe me, those computers weren't installed in a rush. Dylan Klebold and Eric Harris, the Columbine High School massacre. Is there some familiarity with this event? It was, if you want to find out more about this event, I think, he's not a filmmaker I recommend very often, because he's very, admittedly, he takes no objective position on anything, but Michael Moore's film Bowling for Columbine is excellent on this. So what happened? They went into their high school, Columbine High School in Colorado, killed 13 people, wounded 24 people. I think of this era, the first mass school shooting, I think it's fair to say. There had been shootings in school in the past in America, but the idea that somebody would go in with direct intent to kill as many people as possible, this kicked it off. And at the time, you hear about this now, like literally every week in America, which it still blows me away every week when something like this happens. It's just like, what is going on? And I haven't been desensitized to it. It's still absolutely awful. You hear about these things, you just think, oh my, what? But this was, the whole of the world went crazy about this. It was, an American media, which is now often looking to explain away mass shootings, especially the things like Fox News and the sort of right-leaning media there was no reaction like that at the time. Everyone was like shocked completely. Bush the second, George W. Bush was being elected at that point. Well, he was in the electoral race at that point. So Clinton was still president when this happened, and he came out and was like, "This is the most appalling event ever to happen on American soil." To be fair, 9/11 was a little while away from that point, and even a gung-ho sort of pretending to be a cowboy idiot like George W. Bush thought that this was absolutely dreadful. In the aftermath of this, when inevitably people look for explanations, the media latched on to, I think, 3 things in particular. Marilyn Manson, who at the time was far less problematic than he is now. I think that's the best way of putting it. Marilyn Manson is a horrendous human being, but they weren't concentrating on why he is a horrendous human being at this point, because we didn't know at that point why he was such a piece of shit, to be honest. His music was largely being blamed. Now, I'm not a big Marilyn Manson fan, but nah, there's not a hell of a lot of that in there.
It's kind of his representation as well, like his fashion was a big part of it.
Well, yeah, I mean, they mimicked his fashion in a big way, yeah. They called themselves the trench coat mafia, and sort of mimicked that. I don't know, to a certain extent, if Manson is even to blame for this, but the all in black, trench coat wearing, a lot of sort of white on black makeup, etc. I can imagine it kind of looked like Kiss a little bit, so there's deeper roots than Marilyn Manson anyway. And 2 games in particular were blamed, Doom and Quake. 2 games that came out, Doom came out in 1993, Quake came out in 1996. You've got Doom at the top there, Quake at the bottom. They're both made by the same company, ID Software. Interestingly, both of them are what we call shareware projects. So for both of these games, you wouldn't purchase the game, you would get a free copy, and then you had to, I think Doom was probably the first game that ever did this, you could actually email the company and they would send you the files via an online FTP server, but you had to pay like 20 quid for the full version, something like that. Quake, built by the same company, is just basically a graphical upgrade of Doom. I think it's probably a little better. Doom, I don't know if I could play that game now, it's really, it would make me sick, I think. I tried playing, they re-released it in 2016 and it's rubbish. It's so boring. I just gave up after a while, I was just like, this is so dull. Anyway, the media concentrates on these two elements. Now, if you actually delve, go back. I didn't realise I could do that. What? Oh, this is a game changer. I'm so happy now. So, the media blames Manson, Doom and Quake, basically. These kids played a shit ton of Quake. They played it, and what do you do in Quake? You get a gun, you run around corridors, shooting everything in front of you. Same sort of thing as Doom. Doom, additionally, has problematic aspects with it. I don't know if you know much about the game, but the idea is that demons have been summoned from hell to do some kind of scientific thing, which I can't quite remember now. And your job as the inventively named Doom Guy, that is the name of the main character in the game, Doom Guy, is to go and kill all the demons. So there's a, like, if you like, a satanic sort of, which obviously plays well in Middle America, as you can well imagine. So the activity and the sort of graphical violence of these games is blamed kind of in a direct causal way for what happened in Columbine. You look at it and you think, right, these kids ran around the corridors of their high school shooting people down with automatic weaponry. What did they do in Doom? They ran around in corridors shooting things down with automatic weaponry. Well, 1 + 1 must equal, and in this case it's actually several million because they've got the sum wrong, but they automatically think 1 + 1 = 2. If you look at how the FBI profiled Dylan Klebold and Eric Harris afterwards, they didn't do this afterwards because they killed themselves immediately after the act, but they did extensive profiling of the two post-mortem, if you like. Harris undoubtedly was a psychopath with a lack of empathy and narcissistic traits. If you looked at his messaging, if you looked at the way that he talked about people, if you looked at the schoolwork he produced, interviews with his parents and family, unquestionably, Eric Harris was a deeply troubled individual. Klebold, less troubled, but unfortunately a personality that tended to be very easily led, very submissive in that sense. Very depressed as a kid, had tried to kill himself multiple times. Very angry young kid as well, but that anger was largely provoked by his interactions with others. Had vengeance issues, which again largely provoked by others. Now these things did not emerge from playing these games. The games themselves might have been contributory factors towards what they did and how they planned what they did, but they didn't create these two young people. There is a whole thing going on. Their family lives were horrendous. I mean, and they didn't. It's not like they came from poor families. They didn't grow up on the breadline or anything like that. They came from like wealthy middle-class families, but like they had no relationship with their parents. They had no relationship really with peers apart from one another and a few other kids that they knew at school. They were bullied incessantly from like the age of 3. These kids were created. They weren't created by video games. Their interest in video games and that kind of solitary kind of activity, and at the time, I mean, you could play things like Doom online, but you could only play it through local area networks, so you had to know the people you were playing with. Solidified their relationships with one another, which were already massively problematic to begin with, because of the experiences that they had and, if you like, the pathologies that they had as individuals. All of this was ignored. More importantly, the fact that they had no diagnoses before the attack, because there was no mental health services. School counselling in the United States is largely about, well, certainly at that point, it's largely about getting you into college. we wouldn't call them counsellors in this country, we'd call them careers advisors, I think. I think that would be a reasonable sort of facsimile of what goes on. They'd know ever any mental, so these two incredibly depressed individuals had never received any assistance for it. It like completely slipped through the net. It did lead, fortunately, to a change in how kids are assessed for mental health issues in the United States and for early screening of problematic traits. But in itself as well, that's really problematic. It's like you say, oh look, this kid dresses in black. let's whack him full of sertraline because he could shoot the place up at some point. There's a whole bunch of stereotyping going on here. Moral of the story, game responsible. No, I don't think so. Game not really responsible at all. There was a whole bunch of other stuff going on. This kid, Patrick, had issues. That's the best thing you can say here. So another one which is always cited by people who think games cause violence. 16-year-old shot both his parents after they confiscated Halo 3 off him because he was basically spending like 19, 20 hours a day playing Halo 3 online. So they were like, this kid is doing no schoolwork, he's not leaving the house, so they took it off him and he literally shot them. And then his defense team used video. This is the interesting twist in this case. His defense team, to avoid, life sentence, etc., cited his video game addiction as a pathological symptom of why he committed murder. Basically, he was saying insanity through video game addiction. That got chucked out, basically. There was no evidence that this kid, again, had really psychopathic personality traits combined with a sort of narcissistic personality disorder. Problematic relationship, as you can well imagine, since he killed them both with his parents. Again, there were multiple factors in his behaviour here. The idea that he just went off on one because they stole the game, that kind of ignored a decade and a half of really problematic relationship with his parents. Which isn't necessarily to victim blame. I'm not trying to do that here. There's far more complex than saying, okay, so it was his parents' fault. No, that's not how it works. But again, the popular media jumps on this idea of Halo 3, violent game, addicted to it, so if you like, a problematic relationship with it, equals violent response. And then we got a British one. I remember this happening at the time, and I remember it happening at the time, oh shit, we're all in trouble here. Warren LeBlanc, Leicester. I mean, not much happens in Leicester, so it did make the news. He stabbed his best friend with a claw hammer. Do you know what I mean by a claw hammer? Like a hammer's got a head and then you've got the claw on the back, for pulling nails. So he used the claw end of a hammer to stab his friend. That is, and I've played it quite a lot actually at one point, and kind of, I'll be honest, enjoyed it as well. It is a method that you can, or actually you were kind of forced to use, because it's a kind of a mission in the original Manhunt game. Manhunt, has anyone ever played Manhunt? Do you know about it? It's kind of disappeared over the years. It's a Rockstar game. It's without any redeeming features as a video game. It is literally, you murder these people as brutally as you can. So really, there's not even really a story. It's not great, to be honest. It's pretty crap as well. I will add that as well. It's not a very entertaining game to play. It's kind of boring. So the papers in the UK were never far away from invoking a moral panic when they can do it. They went straight on this. Kid plays Manhunt, stabs somebody with a claw hammer in Manhunt, then stabbed his friend with it. Warren LeBlanc didn't own Manhunt, and he only played it with his friend very few times. His friend played it a lot, the guy who was stabbed. But there was no evidence that Warren LeBlanc played this game at all. both the judge and it became a thing that you know, the media wanted this game. You know, this happens, like, you know, media said, we've got to ban this sick filth. You know, following on from the Bulger murder in 1993 in the UK, where you saw things like Child's Play 3 banned, even though those kids never watched the film. Reservoir Dogs, for example, was delayed for coming out on home media until 1996 because it was super violent. It actually isn't a violent film, weirdly, and the only act of violence in the film is never shown on screen either, which is, although he does talk, I think it's very funny when he talks into the ear. That's fucking hilarious, to be fair, but hear that? Sorry. The judge and the police, and importantly the police who investigate this, rejected any kind of association between these two things. There was no evidence that that kid even did that in that game. You couldn't say, you know, the kid said, I didn't do that in the game, and it's like he never got far enough into the game to actually do that act. Kid was deeply disturbed, really, really badly disturbed. Came from a really problematic family background. There was a lot of drug addiction involved. There was a huge amount of neglect involved. He'd been in and out of school. He'd been expelled from school. He had been suspended from school for multiple times for violent acts in school, for harassment, for general aggressive tone, all since he was in primary school. This is, you know, he wasn't in secondary school doing this. Since he was like 5. This was a behavioural thing that was going on with him. Amount of help given to this kid? Any ideas? 0. Yeah, there was none. He'd never been counselled for his behaviour, never been counselled for the causes of his behaviour. No interventions to help him with this behavioural style that he had as an individual. So, contributory factor? Well, possibly. And, you know, as a kid who played other games as well. But, again, the media latched on to Manhunt. It had already provoked a huge controversy, which is obviously what Rockstar wanted. You don't make a game like that in order, you know, for it to be quiet. They were trying to build this reputation as like the badasses of video games. It kind of blew up in their faces on this, but I'm kind of reticent to even say it was their fault. You know, I don't really see how it was anything to do with it. But again, if you look at the literature on this, this is going to come up. And people do tend to ignore the big point at the bottom. That, you know, when it was investigated, this crime, it was rejected as anything to do with what he did. The police were like, no, he was a violent, aggressive individual. I mean, they fell out over something absolutely ridiculous. Like, literally something as like a bottle of cola or something. It was that small, you know. These explanations always miss context. So, Henry Jenkins argued in the early 2000s that video game shootings are never considered in context. What he calls the video game shootings. When a kid goes in and shoots up a high school, and it's always blamed on video games, the video game shootings. And the context is never considered. There has never been a game, well, I'm going to pull back on that one a second. There has only been one game where you are encouraged to go into a school and shoot up the place. But there has been one game that has done that. That game is not available. Unsurprisingly, but there was a game developed for PC about 15 years ago where the purpose was to go into your high school and kill as many people as you could. Unsurprisingly, it did not see a wide release and was pulled very, very quickly afterwards. There was a weird time in reaction to all this stuff in America, like between 2005 and 2008, because there was another game that came out that did have a wide release. I can't quite remember the title of it now, but it was something like Super Kennedy was the name of it. And what you had to do was, it recreated the assassination of John F. Kennedy. And you literally had to blow his head off. I'm up for a lot of things, but that's a bit close for me, like, you know. And it was praised for its realism. Unsurprisingly, it did not stay on sale for very long, but I think you can play it online. I'm pretty certain that you can play a browser version of it. Jenkins's point is that we don't play games that do this. The context in which we're violent in video games is never the context in which people are violent in everyday life. So the idea that doing A causes B is never easy, because obviously the person responsible has to be involved in a recontextualization of the actions that they're doing. Even if we want to accept that argument, you must be doing a huge amount of cognitive work to actually position what you're doing in this new context. So if I'm like doing Red Dead and I'm shooting up a farm somewhere in 1890, whatever it is, or 1901 or whatever year it is, how do I recontextualize that to my classroom? It's a completely different context altogether. So the simple linkage here just falls down at even a cursory glance. You know, there aren't games set in schools where you just go around shooting things. You know, Doom is not school. I used to feel that way about school, that it was from hell, but it wasn't the same kind of hell that we were putting in Doom, like, you know. So even the basic starting link here is really, really so simple. But there is a huge discourse on violence in video games. So Williams's research looked at a series of games across, starting in the 1980s, and looked at how video games talked in popular media. How are they talked about in the press, magazines in the United States? Looking at things like Time and Newsweek and so on, and the major newspapers like the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, etc. Discourse in those games, looking across a long period of time, played with misconceptions and frequently vilifies the game itself, not the player. And it's that, I think, which is really, really important. And the more conservative the newspaper or magazine itself, the more you saw this kind of comment. Blame the game, don't blame the individual. If you blame the game, then you have an easy explanation for the actions that are taking place. Don't look into the person who did it, because the explanations become complex and they shine a light on how people are socialized in Western culture. So you say, like, you know, Eric Harris never had any counselling. Why did he never have any counselling? Well, there's no money put in by the federal government for counselling services in schools in the United States. It's like, so who's responsible here? And it's like, it was years and years of conservative federal government. It's like, oh, we don't want to blame them because that's the because we support, right? So don't ever pick on things which shine a light on the political issues that we actually support. You don't want more money to go in schools, you want less money to go in schools, right? Because you want to pay less taxes. So the less we can spend, the better it is. And if our argument here is actually to avoid these things from happening, we're going to have to spend more in schools, we're going to have to pick up these kids, we're going to have to do a lot of psychological screening of young people, it costs a lot of money. We're going to have to put support in place for people, that costs a lot of money too. Fuck, no right-wing news outlet is going to advocate any of that stuff. So instead, what's easy to do is, oh, it's the game's problem. This is all about the game. The game is really bad. And if we can concentrate on the game being awful, we can ignore the wider context of why these activities take place. In particular, news coverage always focuses on kids. And it always focuses on male kids, in particular. Now, there's two aspects to that why it's bad. One, it misses out on all of us, because we're all older. So our playing of video games is never considered. And there's very little evidence out there to suggest that adults who play violent video games commit violent acts. In fact, there's virtually none. This is interesting because as adults we have a different moral frame to children anyway. But there's also nothing about female players or women. Why do you think? Why are women ignored? And I use women in a broad sense here. I also mean, like, you know, women who are younger, or girls. for the word that we usually use, but I don't actually like using that word in
Because
lectures.
girls only like dress-up games and not violent games.
Controversial.
No, like they were saying that.
Well, there's an assumption made, which is, yeah, absolutely. Girls don't play violent video games, right? Well, of course they do. Yeah, of course they do. Yeah, but I think the cultural assumption is quite accurate there, that, you know, of course they don't. But that's not true. But it's very important. But there is something else. And it is kind of obvious. Okay. Women and girls are far less likely to commit violent acts. They're not particularly less likely to play violent video games. They very often play exactly the same games as males do. But they are far, statistically, almost insignificant in terms of committing violent acts. So, this basic idea that the game has a causal relationship with violence ignores a massive gender bias in terms of violent behaviour itself. Don't talk about women, don't talk about girls, because it will blow your argument up. Because instantly you say, you want to say that there's a causal relationship between violent video games and so on? That doesn't really work. In fact, it would imply to me that the causal relationship is really contingent on having a Y chromosome. You want to get into that argument, then we're in real trouble, because you've got big problems then, because then you've got to get into genetics. So, this kind of discourse ignores the fact that, in fact, the vast majority, and I mean 99.9999% of game players, don't commit violent acts at all. And this is the really problematic thing. If you want to blame Doom for school shootings, you're going to have to explain to me the millions of kids in the 90s who played Doom and didn't do that. Well, what's that all about? If you want to tell me Doom caused Harrison Klebold to shoot up Columbine High School, alright, you make that argument. And then you tell me about the 100 other kids in Columbine High School at exactly the same time, receiving the same education, in the same community as those two kids, who did not go in with AK-47s and kill 13 of their, school colleagues, their peers. Well, you're going to have to do that. Because if you want me to have a causal relationship here, I need to know why them two kids did it and why those didn't. Where's the cause and effect relationship going on here exactly? I think there were other fucked up kids in that school. Very implausible. We often think of school in terms of our own context. American high schools are massive. There was 5,000-6,000 kids at that school. They weren't the only two who had fucked up childhoods. They weren't the only two who had fucked up childhoods and played Doom. I guarantee it. They weren't the only two who had fucked up childhoods, played Doom, and listened to Marilyn Manson. There's loads of kids listened to Marilyn Manson at the time because he was huge. So why didn't those kids do it? And if you want to argue that video games have this relationship, you're going to have to explain that. And I don't think that, I'm playing devil's advocate, right? There is no explanation for that. It doesn't work. We have a series of theories of violence in video games, and none of them really work. Media effects, catharsis theory, cultivation theory, social learning theory, which is closely related to media effects, cognitive neo-association theory, and the culmination, I guess, of media effects and social learning theory is the general aggression model. These are all psychology theories. Does anyone know what the major problem with psychology is as a discipline? You've studied psychology.
Yeah.
Anyone else do A-level psychology? Nick, you did? What's the problem with it? What do you kind of learn doing? It's a long time since I taught A-level psychology, I'll be honest, but I assume you still learn, you learn studies, and key studies, things, and then what do you do to those studies?
So, evaluate the validity.
Evaluate the validity. And is there any study you did in the 2 years of your A-level which passes the validity test? No. Which basically leads me to the conclusion that all psychology is complete bollocks. there's very little work in psychology which actually passes any kind of ecological validity test, i.e. can be applied to everyday life without problematic aspects. Psychology studies, especially in the United States, have two major problems. They're nearly all done with college kids aged between 18 and 21 because they all need credit for their psychology courses. And two, they're nearly all done in experimental circumstances, which means you're taken out of the real world and put in a non-real situation, and then your behaviour is observed, and then you are put back in the real world, and then you think back and say, that's weird, wasn't it? Yeah, it is fucking weird to do that. You don't behave normally in that circumstance. When you're taken away from the normal context, you do everything, you act in an abnormal fashion. This is the ecological validity argument, right? Psychologists love me. Do you know when they do talks in university and I turn up? I thought they do know this stuff, but they kind of ignore it. And so then they see some guy from media come along and pull all this stuff, and they thought, he's not coming again. He can fuck off, this guy. So, the media effects model. Craig Anderson is a guy who comes up time and time again in the literature. Craig Anderson is, I actually read an article, I think in The Independent a couple of months ago, where somebody was doing an interview with Craig Anderson, and he's still banging this drum. And it's like, Anderson, you fucking fraud. You have been blown away on this years ago. Shut up. But he's made a fucking career out of basically giving the right-wing media what they want to hear. That's what I think his career is. He's a bit like Jordan Peterson. He tells people what they want to hear, and then he becomes big, right? And it's like, Jordan Peterson doesn't have a fucking clue what he's talking about. You should not take him seriously. But I think he's kind of a bit of a joke, to be honest. Anderson is the same. A reputable psychologist, no doubt. You know, he's a PhD, you know, a lot of academic papers and so on, but I've never read anything by him that I didn't think, well, you could drive a truck through the logic here. I mean, it's really problematic. He has, over the years, done a lot of what we call meta-analyses. Anyone know what that is? It's a really, really problematic way of doing research and meta-analysis. What you do is, you look for all the research that's been done in a particular area, and then you look for the trend across that research. The reason why it's a problematic thing is, that only works scientifically if everyone did the same thing. If everyone asked the same question, used the same groups of people, did it in the same kind of places, with the same kind of materials and so on. So when you engage in a meta-analysis, you're abstracting the context of even how the research was done to look at the top level of something. So Anderson has done a huge number of meta-analyses, and apparently he has revealed the video game effect sizes in terms of violent behaviour are larger than the effect of second-hand tobacco smoke on lung cancer. Because if you do a statistical analysis of these things, you can sort of assess, you know, what is the statistical probability of getting lung cancer if you're exposed to second-hand smoke. Again, that's a really problematic way of doing research in itself, because you don't have the context of, you know, where did you get the smoke? Do you already have a predisposition towards lung cancer, etc.? One cause for lung cancer, I know I smoke, all right? I'm not trying to do the pro-smoking thing here, but there isn't just one cause for lung cancer, there is a lot, right? The fact of lead exposure on IQ scores. I mean, I can tell you about that because, like, you know, my family's from Leith. You know, they're all thick as shit. There's loads of lead in the water in Leith. So it does have a major effect. There's causal relationship there, definitely. Calcium, and he reckons, you know, video game violence has larger effect than these scientific things based on his meta-analyses of them. Nobody agrees with him, basically. His methodology is so bad, it's not even funny. It's like, oh my god, this guy's an amateur. Huge methodological flaws, because the meta-analysis approach in itself is problematic. This is psychology research. He only looks at stuff in America, and he only looks at it from a certain set of universities and researchers that actually agree with him in the first place. His selection bias is stunning, which is, I kind of encourage people to do selection bias and writing essays, but this isn't an essay. This is not doing that kind of thing. If you remember back to year one, do you remember I showed you this really fucked up video on Zoom of the kids playing Tetris?
and then like one kid beats the other one, and the other kid gets really angry and like starts punching him and lays him out, and in the end pisses all over him. Do you remember me showing you that video? I'm gonna have to find that on YouTube now. I definitely put it on Zoom, alright, because that's the kind of shit that I do. I'm gonna find that. He is kind of that guy, as far as I'm concerned, Anderson, because it's the media effects debate. Media effects debate in media studies is that, you know, media causally affects behaviour. This is not a serious position. Nobody thinks that. Unless, the only way that would work is if you were born, Jack, right, and we put you in a glass box, and you, like, expose you to nothing, and then expose you to something, and you had a violent response. Then we could say, oh yeah, it works. But guess what? We've created a monster at that point, because you have no socialization whatsoever. You are completely fucked as a human being, because we have chosen to do that to you. There is no possible, plausible way that you can sustain this argument, basically, unless you had like a kid who did that, and then he was like, you monsters, you're all going to jail for a very long time for doing this to this child. It's a really interesting, has anyone watched The Boys, the TV show? There's a really interesting argument along those lines with Homelander in that series, because he's fucked as a character, right? But it's really nicely explained why he is fucked up in the way that he is. I kind of really like that show. I hate superhero stuff, but that show's really good. Especially the first scene when the guy runs through that guy's girlfriend. That's fucking hilarious. I watched that in slow-mo and freeze frame it. His face when the blood is up is just... And I don't know if anyone's watched the more recent ones with the orgy, the superheroes orgy. That was great. When the guy opens the door, yeah, it's yeah, that made me laugh too much. So the media effects debate is not taken seriously in media studies. It's not taken seriously in sociology. It is not. I would argue it's not really taken seriously in psychology either. I don't think any kind of mature form of psychology takes this argument seriously whatsoever. But it does show a methodological flaw. If you look at enough stuff that confirms what you're looking at, you can argue that there's a causal relationship here that we're not seeing. Because look at all these things that have found the thing that I'm looking at. But one of the weird quirks of statistics is if you combine enough weak relationships together, they form a strong relationship in the analysis. This is one of the sort of confirmatory biases of statistics itself. All of this research as well is based on a flawed statistical process. Has anyone ever heard the phrase, correlation does not imply causation? When you have two variables which always interlink with one another in a positive fashion very often, like, for example, wealth and educational attainment. Very strongly positively correlated. The wealthier your family is, the higher your educational attainment. This is a very solid relationship across most Western societies. Actually not all, but